Hello, hello, hello. My name is Shakira Smalls, and I am the Executive Director for the Langston Hughes Community Library and Cultural Center in Queens, New York. I am excited to be a part of this project team, and I hope everyone has been enjoying the first two sessions, and now we're going to jump into the third. This session is entitled Contemporary Issues and Documented Black Lives Through Black Newspapers, Black Data, and Black Digital Archives. This session covers how racialized harm against Black people is discussed and portrayed in digital spaces and some of the ways scholars and memory workers are addressing documentation and storytelling around this issue post-2020. This panel is Black Girl Magic. We have Dr. Kim Gallen, Associate Professor of History for Purdue University, Dr. Tonia Sutherland, Assistant Professor of Library and Information Science for the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I hope I didn't butcher that. And Dr. Paulette Brown-Hines, founder of Voice Media Ventures and publisher of Black Voice News. Ladies, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Shakira. Hi, Dr. Brown-Hines and Dr. Sutherland. How are you both doing?
Good, good. Excited to be here.
Yes.
Good. Yes. Also excited.
I've been looking forward to this for a long time. It was one of the things I wanted to do most, and all the things that you get invited to do. So I really want to just say, thank you to Archiving the Black Web for having us all here today. I know Dr. Sutherland and Dr. Brown-Hines, you guys think and feel the same way. I know I can say that. So we're gonna get started. This has been a year, right? Meaning 2020, and the stuff just keeps coming as it relates to Black people, right? So, voter suppression, police brutality, obviously COVID, right? This notion of a racial reckoning around increased structural and personal racism. I don't know about y'all, but in some ways it feels like you have all this stuff coming at you at different moments, right? And it feels overwhelming. And then the weird thing about this is that at the same time that it seems as though there's all this reinscribed structural racism and the pressures of being Black, there's all these new opportunities that are opening up, right? I developed an organization in the span of a year. I connected with Paulette, Tanya, I got introduced to your work. There's a new way of thinking about political organizing as it relates to Black people. There's this attempt to acknowledge structural racism in different disciplines, industries, businesses, right? So it's this weird sort of disconcerting mix of oppression, but also openings up, right? So what we're going to do today, I think, is have a really robust exchange about the disjuncture of oppression and opening up of new ways of thinking about a new future for Black people. And Paulette, your work with Black Voice News, right? And your long commitment to Black communities and Black media. And then Tanya, your work with Source Hawaii and the community engagement and the lab that you've developed there. And then obviously my work that really started in the digital with the Black Press Research Collective and CovidBlack. I think our work overlaps in so many different ways. And so just so the audience know, we're gonna have an exchange and bring up a lot of different topics for about an hour, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So this is a question I've been dying to ask y'all. And so the audience know, I send an email to them really quickly, like, I think I want to start off with this question, right? And they've been very, very generous in letting me start off with this question because it's a very motivated, there's an ulterior motive about this, right? So, I guess people are going to start thinking about the 21st century, at least the third decade, or going into the third decade, is pre-2020 and post-2020, right? So as we start thinking about what post-2020 looks like, and as we start thinking about documenting Black people's lives and what that looks like, the biggest question I want to ask is, whose Black life are we really talking about when we talk about documenting Black lives? Who are we committed to really investing time and resources to leave sort of a presence for generations to come, right? what does that look like? Are we talking about certain gender, sexuality, class? Shoot, we can even talk about complexion, right? So, I mean, what are we really talking about when we talk about Black life? So I want to hear from y'all, and then I have some thoughts I want to share too.
Tonia, you want to start?
No, Paulette, go ahead, take it away.
Tonia, you know that's not right. You're gonna have to go first.
Wait. So I intentionally said Tonia could go first on this one, but I saw that note. Like, do you want to start with this? So for me, and I'll be brief so we can maybe have a discussion about it.
Sure.
You know, as you mentioned, Kim, we have different work we're doing, but there is overlap.
Right.
So for me, the work I initially started doing with Black Voice News is just a little bit about the paper, just to give a little context. We're a local kind of regional paper in Southern California, in the Inland Empire, Riverside, San Bernardino counties. For those of you not from California, we're close to LA, in the shadow of LA. And as a legacy publication, our focus has been on Black folks in this region. Small population of Black folks in this region, but we've been here for, as an outlet, been here for 50 years and really focused on uncovering stories, important stories that affect our people in this region. Now with the digital transformation, for us, just actually very new work, you know, we've been able to expand a little bit. So when we look at the work we're doing, our footprint is expanded, and it's really looking at California, Black folks in California. We're trying to do a lot more with data. And so it's just as easy to get data on Black folks in California as it is to get, actually sometimes it's easier to get data on Black folks in California than it is to get up in our region and in cities within our region. So we're looking at a larger footprint, like I said. When you talk about Black folks, we talk about that a lot with our team. We talk about immigration and communities, what communities within our community. We talk about gender. We talk about also the age differences. You know, we are part of like I said, a legacy publication that we may focus on our older population, and we're finding that, you know, how do we address the needs of younger folks, younger Black folks, and doing that in multiple ways. So for us, it's like a constant, you know, thinking through who are we, you know, really talking about here, and then for us, you know, where do they live? It's really about kind of like a place-based, you know, work we do. But that's how, when I started thinking about that, you know, it's this shift from being in the lived environment and focused on a very small geography to much more expansive view of the work we're doing when we talk about documenting Black lives.
Yeah. You know, Kim, I thought about this question a lot. And my answer, I think, starts as my answer to a lot of things maybe do, which with my mother, and maybe a nursery rhyme. So you remember that nursery rhyme that goes, don't step on the cracks, you'll break your mother's back, right? So as a child, I believe this to be true, and really started paying attention to where all of the cracks were. And I find that as an adult, I still have this habit of looking for the cracks, looking for the gaps, looking for the vagaries. So my work is, the book project that I'm working on right now is about digital afterlives and the ways that Black people continue to show up in digital environments even after we die. And so I think, you know, in the aftermath of 2020, one of the things that we're doing in terms of documenting Black lives is looking at those echoes and those spaces and the shadows and the cracks where Black people's lives used to be, where Black people used to be, right? And so I think part of what we're doing right now in terms of documenting Black life is actually thinking about how we document Black death.
That's really important, right? Yeah, I want to dig into that a little bit more because obviously, you know, my work with CovidBlack is also engaging that. And this is the first time I've ever had these, both sort of the personal, but also the intellectual questions about what that would mean, right? To document the afterlife of Black people. So I want to get into that a little bit more, because the whole notion of privacy and confidentiality and who gives permission to that gets all loaded. And so Tonia, I know that's a lot of part of your work, but to answer my own question, here's some of the things I'm really concerned about when we think about documenting Black lives, right? So, I'm a historian, so I got to go back before I can come forward. And I think that we have a more narrow sort of representation of Blackness in some sense, right? In some sense, in terms of what we think about as acceptable Blackness, right? So Paula, I'm going to take you back to the early 20th century in the Black press, where you got a lot of wide coverage of people we might consider to be trans people today, right? In the Black press, in the respectable Black press, right? And I'm not saying that the coverage was always good, right? There was definitely disparaging coverage, but they were there. So if you looked at the weekly sort of what happened this week in Baltimore, you were looking at the balls, right? And everybody was going to there, right? But now you're hard pressed to find any coverage of trans Black communities in a Black newspaper in the 21st century, right? Hard pressed. When we think about COVID, where are the Haitians? Where are the Caribbean Americans? Where are the, African people that are born African but have immigrated to the United States? So I think in some ways, even as we have this more open web and these more tools and technologies, one might argue that when we talk about documenting Black people's lives, we're talking about a very sort of narrow scope in some sense, right? In terms of what makes the sort of mainstream Black coverage, and again, get into this notion of acceptable Blackness, right? So I wondered what your thoughts were about that. Especially, Paula, I'm interested in hearing from you in terms of a media sort of coverage and representation and documentation, because I was just saying, 100 years from now, I still would argue that one of the biggest archives for understanding what it was like to be Black in the 21st century will be the Black press. And so what will people understand about that documentation?
Yeah, and it's a challenge, and I think part of the challenge, though, especially on for Black press, is just a resource. There's a resource challenge too, right? I've been fortunate in being able to develop a team, and it's interesting because the young journalists that are starting to work with us are talking about ethnic diversity within Black identity. So I'm married to Black Central American. One of our writers, new writers, a family is from the Caribbean, and we have a large Nigerian student population, for instance, where we live. And so we would love to cover more about like the nuances of our identity. And I think we'll get to that point, but I think part of the challenge is it's a resource. It's a resource challenge. And so you don't end up really being able to really dig into the differences. And I think with the work we're doing with data, you do start to see differences. And that's where you can at least start to tell some of those stories.
Yeah. The only thing I would say, there's always been a resource challenge in Black media, right? And so I just wonder what the politics of I'm just going to keep going with trans Black people, because that's, I have a chapter in my book if anybody wants to read it, but that's another thing. So
I just got it. I can't wait to read it.
But seriously, I wonder about a shift in politics around Blackness that doesn't make covering certain communities of Black people expedient.
I'm wondering, Kim, because honestly, I just got the book. I actually just picked it up from the post office. It was mailed to me a day ago, and it was just kind of skimming through just in preparation for this session. And I was surprised to see some of the trans part of that. In some of the, I was just looking at kind of the historic legacy Black publications. what do you think has happened that we don't see that kind of diversity in our own reporting?
Yeah, I actually think that there's a more conservative, more conservative view of Blackness in some sense, right? I think the web and social media has created, one could argue, sort of a democratization of being able to tell your own story. But I think when we look at what's covered, I think a certain conservatism has taken over, whereas the Black press used to be much more independent, right? And not necessarily as concerned with mainstream publications or sort of mainstream life because of segregation. I'm not repping or trying to romanticize segregation in any shape, form, or fashion, but I do think that a certain conservatism in Black media has sort of come in a post-civil rights movement era, right? So many people look at the civil rights movement and suggest that during that movement, it was clear that there were certain communities of Black people that weren't expedient to advocating for social justice or civil rights. But we can talk about something, we can move on here, but it's just something I've been thinking about in terms of, whose Blackness are we really talking about when we talk about archiving? I know you guys have questions.
What happened to Tonia on our screen?
Oh, I'm here.
Okay.
Okay. Yes. Sorry about that. Internet went out here in Honolulu for a minute, kicked me out. Yeah. Now I'm back. I was just going to observe, and I think I missed a piece of the conversation that even with the sort of lack of documentation, the sort of lack of broad documentation, that the Black press has and continues to be really valuable in just offering parallel or counter narratives, right, to what the mainstream press is putting out there. So, there's clearly work to be done there, but there's also still just so much value in having those Black and other ethnic presses.
Tonia, can we talk about this notion of the afterlives again, or afterlives as you talk about them, and the way that, because I've been concerned about this, right, in terms of protecting Black people's lives, right, whether they're in the physical or in some sort of metaphysical or the afterlife. How do you deal with that in your work in terms of like, what are you documenting? What are you not documenting? And you talked about this notion of the cracks, right? Because I'm of the mind that some things need to be in the cracks, right? I do this all the time. I'll be tweeting something. I'll remember, I'm like, not every person that follows me is Black. Let me just pull this tweet back, right? So some things need to remain in the cracks because they're not for everyone. So how do you make those decisions?
It's a great question. And, I'd love to hear what you both have to say about this too, because, it's in many ways, it's a question of audience, right? Yeah, but I am very careful in giving talks, and as I'm writing, to not reproduce images and videos that show Black people in harm's way, violence against Black people. If I'm giving a talk and it's about lynching, I will show a picture of the white spectators instead of the Black person who has been lynched.
Even in class. Like, so when you're teaching, this is the same practice you use in class?
It is. I do. It is. And when I talk to my students, we talk about access, right? We talk about audience, and we talk about appropriate access. We talk about, for whom are we doing this, and who should have a say and who should have a voice in how public or private this is. In my writing, I will do a lot of descriptive work rather than recreate or show images.
Tonia, I'm curious, because as a newspaper person, especially as a Black press, I think of our role in kind of bearing witness, and also our kind of advocacy for justice. And I was thinking about that, and just, when we looked at our questions, we had our kind of pre-conference, conversation. And, I thought about, the reason Mamie Till wanted her son's image shown, right? And
Yes.
then for us, for the Black Voice News, for instance, we had a police shooting back in the late 90s. Taisha Miller was killed and shot over 12 times in medical distress, asleep in her car. Her cousin called 911 and ended up with police, and within minutes she was dead. And my parents made a decision. I mean, they worked with the family of the young woman. They were as an advocacy kind of publication advocating for the community, they were there covering the protests that happen every week for a year, right? They also made a decision to publish on the front page the kind of autopsy drawings. It was just where she was shot. And in part of that, it was because the audience wasn't just our community. The audience was policymakers, that was civic leaders, it was elected leaders, it was the folks who were trying to decide, how do we solve this problem? And so I think for us, there's that kind of, we think of audience, we know our audience is more than our community. And oftentimes we're the voice that's trying to make change. And so that's why I think we have to, I was thinking about that, how, why we made that decision. And I think my parents did get some criticism for doing that, but it also helped, the Attorney General make the case for a consent decree, for the city to make a decision to create this kind of police review commission, to really try to create some reform.
Right. I mean, that's exactly right. And I think we're in good company, right? Because Frederick Douglass was really, really thoughtful about the image and what the power of the image and what the image could do, right? Du Bois was the one that sent Elizabeth Freeman to Waco to report back on the Jesse Washington lynching, and those images get published in the Crisis, right? So, I think there are people who have been thinking about this for a really long time. And I think it says something that we are still thinking about this, right? Yes, without Darnella Frazier, the world doesn't see the George Floyd video, and we don't get where we are with the Derek Chauvin trial, right? So there's a really important aspect about bearing witness, and in my research, I consider that part of my it's something I feel called to do, to actually myself bear witness, but I don't impose that, I guess, on anyone else. And I try to be really thoughtful and careful, because I'm so aware of all of the ways that our suffering gets commodified.
Well, Tonia, I want to ask you a personal question, because you brought it up, and then I want to talk about this notion of commodification. So when you say you feel called to bear witness, does that mean that you will watch a video? Because that's so interesting, because I started off doing that as well, because I also felt called to bear witness in some sort of obligation or some sort of way of reckoning with what has happened. And I just couldn't do it anymore. I just was so traumatized that psychically the wounds were too deep. And I actually even felt guilty of even saying that, because I'm like, I'm here in the flesh, I'm alive, I'm healthy, and with an extraordinary amount of privilege, but I just couldn't do that. So I find that, first of all, I find it admirable, and I understand that from a very sort of a very connected sort of Black sort of experiential way. But I emotionally, I don't know about you, Paula, but emotionally, I just could not, take it. I started off watching some of them, and I just couldn't anymore. So.
Yeah. I'm with you. I couldn't even watch the entire George Floyd. I couldn't. And I remember I didn't even know exactly what happened. My husband had I had been doing something and wasn't connected online, didn't know what was happening. And he left the house, and he just like had to go for a drive. And there was something that a tone had changed and I had no idea what was happening. So by the time I started, got online, I knew I couldn't watch the entire thing. I just couldn't. And I think of often like Ida B. Wells documenting, hundreds of lynchings, and I think of my staff, and even that, making sure that we have those kind of check-ins when we talk about, police violence in our community. I'm not just saying nationally, but just in our community. And us trying to cover that, and being able to really think about the trauma that that just in bearing witness, and trying to be understanding that. It's really interesting. There's a recent article, and I can't remember which a news outlet did this, but they offered 2 ways of reading the story so that you didn't have to watch.
Really? Which publication was that?
I'll find it, Kim. I'll let you know.
Okay. Maybe everyone
to know too. Yeah.
Other people probably want to hear it too. Tonia, I wanted to ask though, I don't know if you want to come back to that in a second, but I want to also ask about, because it does again connect to this idea of bearing witness and sort of, I saw someone said a theater of Black murder. I like that phrase, but the commodification and the co-option, right, of Black people's death or images of Black people. And I'm going to be real here, even by the institutions that we work at, right, which I'm always resisting. I'll just speak for my own institutions, wanting to co-opt my work to say, oh, look what our faculty member is doing, and this faculty member got this grant, right? And how, because I think in some ways Paulette has it. Paula, can I say that you started off as an academic, but then she got out of it.
She got free.
That's a whole nother story. But I think Paulette has a certain autonomy and agency to ward off that sort of co-option. But I think for me, Tonia, I'll just speak for myself. I'm always sort of navigating this sort of space, because my work at the end of the day is for the Black community, but often working in the institution puts pressures on what I can do, who it's for, who's actually, particularly when you teach at a predominantly white institution, right? In a predominantly white area, this notion of creating and archiving and documenting Black lives for the Black community gets really, really, really tricky. So I want to talk about the commodification and how do you, if your work is for Black people and other people, but your central audience is for Black people, how do you maintain that ability to do that work?
Whew. That is the central question. The chapter that I'm working on right now, I've been struggling to write for this exact reason. That's the central thing that I'm struggling with, right? Because as I write, I'm writing this for Black people, and I recognize that that's not going to be the only audience. It's an academic book being published by a university press, right? And therefore it's being published through all of the same, it's coming into the world, being born into the world through all of the same structures that I'm critiquing as problematic and co-opting and commodifying, and it feels like, it feels untenable in terms of integrity, right? It really does. So, I would just love to keep having this conversation with people and kind of see where we land, because it's a tough one, and I don't really have any definitive answers. Yeah.
What are you thinking when you think about, again, I feel like maybe there are challenges and issues that I'm not seeing in terms of publishing, but do you feel as though you have that same tension?
It's a good question. I'm trying to think of how, it's what's interesting is I think it goes back to that question of audience too. And we're doing this shift. So we're moving from kind of print advertising focused revenue to trying to go to like this audience driven revenue. And so talking to my staff has been really interesting because there's an assumption that our audience and the audience that will support us is all Black and, you know, Black Voice News. And I tell them, no, it really isn't. When I look at like some of our first donors, I'd say 80% were white in our community. I mean, they care about social justice issues. They care about justice in general. And so they think the work we're doing is important and they want to support it, but it's not fully, a Black audience. Yeah. And so, I do think about like how we're telling stories, whose stories we're telling. I mean, that's, and I know it's not, because it is, public as well, right? Once we put it out, it's not just in print delivered to specific, to the Black church anymore, where predominantly will be seen by Black folks, is out on the web. That is something that we struggle with. Yeah, we do.
It's funny as you say this. I'm thinking about audience again, right? And I'm thinking about, well, so what does it mean to do work for Black people? And again, Paula, you are in the business of selling papers and covering Black communities. So you really do have to pay attention to what your audience want, right? But I remember a couple, like maybe 4 or 5 months ago, as I was talking about this, digital memorial of Black people that have passed away from COVID-19. And somebody on Twitter was like, well, what Black person told you to do this, right? So I was like, man. Like, did the Black community really ask you to do this work, right? And I stopped for a minute because, I mean, real talk, when you say you do work for, your work is for Black people, well, who's asking for this work? So my question again is, how much of the work that we do when we're archiving or doing these projects, particularly in digital spaces, and we say, well, we're doing this for the Black community, how much of the desires, needs, and the interests, right, and the real needs of Black people are being taken into consideration? How much of it is, me, Kim Gallen, coming from my privileged space saying, okay, this is what Black people need, and we're going to come into these communities with my talented 10th self and tell y'all what y'all need in order to be free, right? So, I mean, how do y'all navigate, what the community wants and then what you do?
You know what's so funny? That's top of mind for me, just because, like, I'd say last week we were having a debate in our newsroom. So we have our executive editor who's older than me. This is her second career. She's really a community journalist. She worked in telecom before, but always had this kind of passion for community journalism. So she's been retired and been running our newsroom. And then we have like some younger folks who are, coming in, and they're new to media, really. And so we're talking about audience, and we're talking about the work we do. And once you kind of shift to an audience-driven revenue strategy, you really have to engage the audience. You have to give the audience what they want. And so we're like, what if what they want isn't what they need? And so we're like, how do we still engage them? Because we need to keep them engaged. We need to hear from them. But we're not going to be doing like entertainment news, or we're not going to be doing
You're not covering Cardi B or something like that.
Right.
Extensively anyway.
Right.
I think that's what Black communities want, but you get, you take my point.
Right. But I mean, when you look at the data and you look at where people go, especially when they go for news, it's like a lot of entertainment news, there's some culture news, but we're like, well, we need to be doing work in our minds. We've been part of this tradition of pointing out discrimination. That's, when my parents first started working with the paper, identifying problems and how do we like solve them in our community, especially when it comes to Black folks. Or we'll get Black folks who reach out to us and say, hey, there's some discrimination in my workplace, or this agency, is not promoting Black folks. Like, look at these things. And it's things that people don't necessarily generally know is a problem necessarily, for us to cover it. So we had to like decide on a mantra, and then within the kind of scope of that mantra, we're going to say to our community, like, what would you like for us to do? Like this is the kind of drawing the boundaries for us, because the work has to be meaningful for us as well.
Yeah,
and we have to feel like and then we have to feel like we're having some impact.
Yeah,
and once again, back to that resource question, we know we're limited in our resources. So we came up with justice seeking reporting as the work. It's kind of as our mantra. That's the work we've been doing and the work we want to continue to do. And within that scope, we're going to engage the community on what they'd like that we're not doing.
But so you built the frame, and within the frame, you engage the community. Right. Nice.
We had to.
Yeah.
I think for me, I the same way I look for cracks, I look for trends, right? So if I see the same issue popping up over and over and over again, or I see like a bunch of different people in different places asking the same question, those are the things that I'm like, okay, this is an area of interest for me, an area that, you know, an area of expertise, or it speaks to an area of expertise, and I start to sort of build projects around that. So I do try to take my impetus from outside my own head and from outside the academy, right? And so I think some of it's really just paying close attention on Twitter and you know, not even looking at trending topics, but being like, that's the 4th time this week I've seen somebody say, hey, it's not cool to do X, Y, or Z, right?
Yeah. And real talk, if you got to ask what the Black community that you're engaging wants, you probably shouldn't be doing work in that community. Seriously, if you're not talking to the Black people in the community, or live there, or have some sort of lived experience, then you might want to, you know, do something else. But I think also, Tonia, I wanted to touch on this notion of, well, first of all, Paula, I want to come back to this thing about what the community really wants and how a lot of traffic is driven to entertainment. And I think that was the perennial problem that, you know, legacy Black media in the early 20th century is facing, right? And so they made their papers really sensational, right? In terms of like headlines, and lots of papers do this. And then, you know, within the paper, there was more substantive, or I shouldn't say more, but other types of content. So I've always said that if legacy Black media wants to be popular again, y'all need to like maybe sensationalize it up a little bit more, roll a little more sex in there, and you'll probably sell papers. But to your point, I love the idea of building this frame, and then within the frame, engaging the community about what they need and want. But Tonia, I want to talk about this notion of appraisal, which was new to me when you posed it as one of the questions that we should talk about what to keep. Am I right in that?
Yes,
right?
yes.
And I've been thinking about that in terms of when I am documenting, again, Black people that have died from COVID. I've been with my data researcher, Joan Mukagosi, which I have to shout her out because she's been amazing. But we strategically have been thinking about, in terms of the profiles, what do we want to keep? What do we want to leave out of these memorials, right? Because a lot of the coverage of the obituaries is about the last days of Black people struggling to breathe and maybe not being seen in the hospital, just, you know, really traumatic stories. And we haven't wanted to tell that story. We wanted to tell a story that is really about recovering people as they were in full sort of life. And so this notion of appraisal is a very political one. And I think for Black people, it's fraught with even more politics because of, again, the afterlife of Black people. I mean, the Black image and the Black, you know, presence is so fraught with all sorts of issues. And I think this notion of appraisal is one that I hadn't really thought, I've been thinking about, but not in this way. So I would love to hear you talk about, you know, what you do and how you address this issue.
Of how I address the issue of appraisal? You know, it's not one that tends to come up for me, although I've got a new project that I'm starting that is doing some work around documenting Black Hawaii. And that's exactly, you know, I mean, that's exactly the question that I'm asking, right? What and who qualifies as Black Hawaii? What narratives will this digital archive tell you know, whose voices will be included, and you know,
right?
again, it comes back to a question of audience, right? If this is a digital archive that's going to be open and freely accessible, and that is to say, not using levels of access. So there are some systems out there like Makurtu that will allow you to have different levels of access to, depending on who you are in the community, right? So I think about appraisal and I think about access, and I it's sort of the beginning part of the process and the end part of the process. And I think there are a lot of decisions to be made at both stages. And the end result of that, of the appraisal decisions, I think also then speak to who should, or conversations about who should have access, right? What you choose to put in will, I think, and should determine who will be able to see it and who will be able to access it. I mean, you're right. These are really political decisions.
Right.
You know, I wanted to add, because I was thinking about that question when I saw it after we talked, and there was a question about data too, like
yes, let's talk about data.
Yeah, and for me, as someone trying to do data journalism, like we're building a team, but it started for us with our mapping work and realizing that to do the mapping work, we wanted to do the visualization work, we really needed better data to do it. And in talking with Burgess, Jules, and we said, look, we need access to data. We probably need to, we also need to find some. We need to. We've been doing some things to try to even collect some. But what's interesting about it is, as we're trying to build this hub, and we're like, okay, what are some of the challenges? One is not having data disaggregated by race. Even at the beginning in California, at the beginning of the pandemic, we were seeing data on Blacks in other states, but we didn't have it disaggregated in California. Like our writer was one of the first ones to kind of ask, like, where is, like, what is this
data?
And then so for us, it was like, it kind of started there, but now that we're trying to do this work and we're trying to focus on solutions, it's like, how do we find the data we need to focus on solutions and not just on the problem? Like, how do you do asset framing? So there's a really interesting article that I read that the Hewitt Foundation put out about, data equity and, things like governance or not just access, but how data is collected. And then asset framing is the thing that we're just talking about in our newsroom. We don't have answers yet, but it's like, what is that data that we need to do solutions, not just data journalism, but solutions.
Or data for awareness. I mean, I was by June, I was like, we know Black people are dying disproportionately, right? And not to minimize the need for that data to really show in certain areas. But this gets back to the commodification again, right? Where data is, there's currency in data for people, right? People are making money collecting data and visualizing data, but what data are they collecting? You are hard pressed to find data on Black health that isn't about disparity or some type of traumatic data, right? Like, where is the data on Black wellness and data on Black people that are, that the health, or just health behaviors of Black people that aren't showing up as comorbidities or something. And again, I'm not minimizing the need for that data, but there are the selective data collection and visualization has very much to do with sort of the disparagement that Black people receive, right, in life around health and health behaviors, right? So Paulette, I hear you in terms of like just the lack of data and how that limits what you can even do, which, by the way, if you have not looked at Black Voice News data dashboard for COVID, it is the best data dashboard on Black people out there, you know, just period. So I would encourage, if someone can put that in the chat, I would encourage people to go take a look at it, because it truly is a model for what could be done that is engaging Black communities and creating data for solutions. I love that. And I think it was Ronaldo Walcott who talked about this notion of, you know, just data just for data's sake, and how that reinscribes sort of trauma and oppression if it's not tied to accountability or some sort of solutions. But when we talk about data, like, what are the limits, particularly around quantitative data, for actually archiving Black people's lives? I mean, you know, I'm facing it in my own work in terms of, you know, I'm trying to get past the sort of the quantitative data, even as we are engaging it by, you know, with the narrative. But, you know, what are the limits of quantitative data?
Yeah, I mean, it shows the big picture, right? But then trying to dig into like what it means.
Yeah.
And I just have to give a shout out to Alex Reed on our team. I have just a great team of Black women who are doing this work. And it's interesting because none of us were trained to do this work.
Right.
So we're all like, so it's funny, it's a culture of learning, and I'm always trying to like convey that and remind the team of that. Alex actually has a background in multimedia from Carnegie Mellon, and you know, is a kind of data nerd, so she's interested in it. But she came to us like graphic design maybe, and she just took some courses on visualization. So she started doing mapping and got into dashboards, and so she pulls the data. But part of the challenge with that you know, that you're referencing, Kim, is still understanding what those numbers mean.
Yeah.
And that becomes, right, so even on our dashboard that we have, there's one on like vaccine distribution, and she did it by this kind of healthy communities index. So, and then she kind of tried to overlay where Black people are in California, what are the healthiest to the least healthiest communities, and then which vaccines were more available in those communities. So in the healthiest communities, Pfizer by far.
Yeah.
There was Moderna was kind of even, and then Johnson & Johnson in the least healthier communities.
And okay, well,
yeah.
You know, and there's you know, you can read that many ways, right? First off, it's access, it's one shot, but then, you know, there are other things that you could,
other issues there,
right? And so we still have to dig into that and then try to understand it. And that's where the, you know, finding the stories, like really understand it. That's where you have to do both.
Yeah.
To be effective when it comes to doing data. We're finding that we have a Black at Work map. So we're looking at the numbers of, you know, how Blacks were affected, workers were affected by COVID, high unemployment. We looked at, you know, more exposure to COVID because they were more in the essential workforce. But when we try to dig into like, what did that look like? You know, we couldn't, that was hard to find the stories. So we created a Black at Work map that was like a crowdsourced map. And it was like the challenge there, back to the questions about privacy and like trying to collect that data.
Surveillance.
And then, you know, that data doesn't just, you know, going back to afterlives, that data doesn't just go away when you die. So, you know, there are all kinds of just wild applications out there that people are developing, that you know, big tech companies are developing, you know, like afterlife chat services. I mean, it's real life Black Mirror stuff. You know, when a loved one passes away, you'll still be able to chat with them because they will have collected enough of your data, your texts, to be able to emulate you after you've passed on, right? So like, you know, when we think about all of the data that we're collecting, we kind of think about the uses, and all of the uses for good, like in the moment and in the present. There are all of these sort of afterlife uses that we haven't even sort of gotten to contending with yet. And yeah, it's wild. I mean, that's how they resurrected Tupac. It was, you know, it's from the data. Yeah.
I'm letting y'all know now. If y'all get a text from me and y'all know I'm going.
Yo, don't text me back. Okay.
Do not text me.
Do not text me back.
No.
I'm done texting.
I am not interested that in any shape, form, or fashion in doing that work or doing, you know, having that experience rather. So I saw someone in the chat said that's terrifying. But I also think, and I think a lot of people across different races and ethnicities, class, genders, whatever identities would say the same thing. But I do want to just go play around with that a little more in terms of like, you know, what does that mean even more so for Black people, right? To have that sort, their data, first of all, their data living in that sort of that context, and their data being used in that way. And just in terms of Black people's data in general and how vulnerable it is, particularly when a lot of us, and like Paula, you know, a lot of this I'm learning now, but a lot of us aren't in situations or schools for whatever reason that where data is presented to us in a way that it's open and accessible for careers or even as just being data literate. Paula, do you want to take that?
So, I actually was curious more about the because it was a question that Tonia had about because I had never even heard this, the digital will, and so I was just I was just curious about just her work, even kind of building on what you were saying, going back into the questions about the digital body and the idea of this kind of what would your digital, like a question about what your digital will would entail. I'm like, what? I had to look it up because I had never even heard the term.
I may have made that up as I was writing that question. I mean, I'm sure it's been used before, but yeah, I mean, we already get so little agency, right? We just do. And you know, I think we, as a community, as a people, we've been very creative in our uses of digital technologies, of technology in general. But you know, like we just have so little say, and that's by design. That I think about Jessica Marie Johnson's work on you know how Black people were quantified and the ways that those things get reinscribed in archival spaces. And I think about you know, Simone Brown's work on surveillance, and you know, it positions us historically. It sort of positions us to be concerned about how our data may be used after we die, specifically and uniquely because of our Blackness. You know, they're starting to store big data sets in synthetic DNA, right? And when we look at Henrietta Lacks and what they did with her DNA, like what are some of the implications for synthetic DNA? And I mean, and you know, it's always going to be Black people's bodies that are the test subjects, that right? So
that's the test subjects, or you know, whatever that may be, right? Yeah.
Right. I'm curious, actually, you know, back to your question, Kim, just about data literacy, and in your work, in Tonia, in your work, I mean, do you think of building in some type of like educational component for our community? And I ask this because as a newspaper, you know, we you know, you're academics and there's a different audience, but you know, we're general audience. And then when we were doing some focus groups through some of our work with the census, and we were talking to you know, Black folks all over the state of California, and there was this desire to understand, like there was a real desire. And I was like, but there's no mechanism really at the community level for there to be to gain understanding. And I'm like, you know, how do we build into the work we're doing that opportunity to really educate our communities on you know, when it comes to data, on data literacy?
Yeah, I mean, that's some of the work that CovidBlack is trying to do with We're actually starting with youth this summer and helping them just to understand basic data literacy, even using something like TikTok, right? Which, you know, so many Generation Z is on, right? And trying to bring sort of just a base level of data, how your data is being used, what you're sharing online, just, you know, even basically just understanding the, you know, basic quantitative data, or understanding the difference between qualitative and quantitative data, right? You know, I know people who are still, you know, Googling that definition, you know, who are, you know, definitely beyond, middle school, high school. And so I think it has to, you know, come out of institutions or organizations, and sort of, if you say, Paulette, sort of be embedded in whatever engagement you're going to do with that particular community. We've chosen youth, right? And youth mean, you know, teens, getting them really excited about data, and hopefully opening up careers about data, and particularly helping them understand the implications of data as being something that they should benefit from their data directly, that other people are benefiting from. But Tonia, I also want to know about your laboratory and your community engagement. Are those sorts of programs and activities in terms of direct community engagement part of what you do also?
So right now, a lot of the lab is still getting off the ground, so it's really exciting. The community engagement work that's being done right now is mostly with one local small Black-led museum, and you know, it's how to say this, there's a huge educational component to that work that's handled by the director of the museum. And we are working with the museum to make, as part of the Documenting Black Hawaii project, to make sure that some of the records that they have sitting actually do get digitized and make it to a digital environment. But you know, I teach community engagement here at UH, and the thing that we start with in that class is that the impetus has to come from the community. Yeah. I teach it as a research method, and all of the students are then required to find a community partner in a community with which they're either already engaged or with which they'd like to be engaged. You know, they have to actually speak to stakeholders in the community. You know, the impetus has to come from the community for the work that they're doing. And so you know, and there's a unit in there on literacy, on digital literacy, and understanding how, and online communities, right? So I think that there are opportunities for this kind of education inside and outside the classroom. And going back to that idea of the digital will, I mean, this is the kind of thing that I mean, I think you're right on here, Kim, that this is the kind of thing that we could be offering trainings and you know, teaching and educational resources around, right? Like, go ahead and say, no, I don't want to be digitally resurrected when I die. Yeah.
Or I don't want to have my data shared with a third party source as I'm opening up a social media account, which, you know, a lot of people just don't even aware what they're actually agreeing to. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I'll drop in the chat the Feminist Data Manifesto, which is a series of commitments and refusals around these kinds of data practices, you know, and the idea is that you both, you know, refuse to just accept that data is disembodied from actual humans, right? And instead commit to seeing data as connected to communities, to people, to real lives, and to impacting real lives as well.
So if I may jump in, because it's time for Q&A.
Do we have to let the audience in? No, just
I know this is a really good conversation, very timely, very informative. For you all that do not know me, I introduce myself as the panel one, but I am Akiba Foster, manager of the African American Research Library and Cultural Center in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and project director for Archiving the Black Web. I want to thank you ladies for bringing to light such wonderful, rich conversations. And so from those conversations, we have some really good questions from the audience. So I am going to pose those. So from Jade Davis, she asked, how you do that count? Oh, so let me see this. How do you counter what is happening at the institution? I am trying to reconcile the move, the Philadelphia move, the bones, and their afterlife, and what that means for doing Black work at these universities.
I had to, I sighed and then exhaled with that. How do you reconcile? Restate that first part again. How do you reconcile?
How do you, I think how do you counter what is happening at the institution? I think this was from an earlier part of some of your conversation.
Yeah.
I'm trying to reconcile the move so that you all can tell the backstory about this recent story about the bones of children being used at universities, but the afterlife, the bones and their afterlife, and what that means for doing Black work at these universities.
Tonia, you want to start with that one, Miss Afterlife? She's gonna get me after this.
So the move bones, those are real human remains.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I think honestly, my thinking lately is that we should be honoring our digital remains the same way we honor human remains. And that, we need to think about the ways that our ancestors honored our dead, right? And our own practices around homegoing. And, I think bringing the knowledge we already have as a community to bear is really critical. In terms of countering the institutions and the university. I wish I had an answer for that question. I really do. I really do. There are lots of subversive things, right? Subversive ways that we already do this. Just our existence is in many ways counter to the institutions for which we work.
Well, and it's a complicated question, and a lot of it depends on where you are in terms of status, right? Whether you're a junior faculty member, whether you are senior, or you're the dean, or in some cases president of the university. But what I will say, when that first hit social media, one of the first people I heard was Dr. Judith Weisenfeld, who is in the religious studies department. I think she's the chair there. And she was like, I'll get back to you. I'm gonna let you know what's going on, right? So using her power, using her status as a senior full professor, she made it very clear, because one of the institutions was Princeton, right? And she made it very clear that she was gonna start asking questions, and she wanted to know what was going on. So I think some of this countering of the way that Black people's bodies and property and just are treated by these institutions have to come from Black people within the institution who have power and status. Because if you're not doing something within these institutions to counter, then why are you even there, right? Why are you there? Other than to be a part of this machine of publishing, right? Which it has value. I'm not going to argue that it doesn't have value. But when I saw her make that statement and then followed up and was engaging other people on social media, letting us know what was going on, at least from the Princeton perspective, it was a model for what you do when you have privilege and you have power, and you're trying to counter, not in a symbolic way through your work, but in a real sort of lived way that's going to really impact people's lives. So that would be my response. Look at someone like her as a model for that.
So our next question is from our partner, Derek Mosley from Auburn Avenue Library. And he asked the question, how do you deal with trauma on a day-to-day basis while collecting this important information? How do you handle trolls and the outside influencers? And if you were part of session 2, you heard somebody say block, 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 but in terms of the trolls, but
Yeah.
the floor is yours.
I would have to say, just to start for us, like I said, there is a lot of conversation with my team when it comes to just the reporting that we're doing, and making sure that there's a lot of self-care. Like when people need to take breaks, they take breaks, and we're very vocal about, the need, and very understanding. I mean, this being in a kind of virtual space now has made it really easy for people to go. I actually had one staff member who went to Hawaii for about 2 weeks, just to kind of leave and be semi-connected, but be able to take some time away. But I think on the other side of that, in terms of like the comments from the trolls or folks on the internet, I've had to, we've talked about that in terms of commentary, comments, and like, do you leave the comment function on the website, for instance? Especially when we're a Black paper in a very conservative community. I've seen it with these aggregators, these apps that take news in, and you have a lot of folks in that region or in that community who get their local news there. And when they see Black anything, they're like making comments. Or when we're criticizing something that's happening in regards to kind of racial incidents in our community, I'm seeing like negative comments. So we made sure we actually turned off certain, on our platform, you could post it on social media, but on our website, we kind of just turn that function off. So we filter it a little bit, but we had to do that. And then I just stopped on the apps. I just stopped reading a lot of those comments. I just had to stop.
Yeah. Yeah, I would just say same thing as Paulette. I mean, I don't engage trolls at all. Either block you or, I mean, I could care less, quite honestly, about, what people outside of my community, and when I say community, the sort of broader Black community might say at any given moment. But in terms of the trauma, there is trauma that's part of the work I do, particularly since, the most recent work is around COVID. But, my commitment to Black people is so strong that, I don't see it as, I'm in the same sort of traumatic way. I'm able to sort of move past that for for the greater good. It sounds kind of simplistic, but, it's not something that I allow to sort of, I don't internalize it, I guess I would say, as much as I can.
I think it's, in some ways, I guess I'll be happy when this book is written, right? Because I've been actively engaging with lynching images, these videos, and for 7 years, since 2000. Well, actually, since Trayvon Martin, it's been about 9 years that I've been thinking about and doing this work. And there are days that it's really hard. I mean, it just is, right? I light a lot of candles. I swim. I swim, and I let that swim be meditative. I don't think about anything when I swim. I just, I wear therapeutic energetic gemstones. Like like whatever it is that I can do to shore up my spirit so that I can be present and bear witness. Because, I hear, when Kim mentioned Mamie Till Mosley earlier, Mosley, like I hear that. I hear, I want the world to see what they did to my son, to my child. And, I take that call very seriously. But in order for me to maintain and get through my days and be okay, I also have to take care of myself, right? And that in and of itself is a radical act on a daily basis. So, yeah.
So thank you. We have a question from Vanessa Irvin. Are there specifically Black ways in which we present data? Like, what actions within our culture would be a specific way in which we present COVID data? I'm thinking in terms of voicedness in addition to numbers and graphs.
Yeah. I would say go look at the homegoing data visual memorial, right? We thought very long, Renee Payne had included her whole team and I thought very long and hard about what that would look like from a Black sort of data visualization perspective. So there's movement there, the colors that we've chosen, the way the data the symbols move in terms of this notion of a transition back to an ancestral home. There's colors of red when we think about red in West Africa around the passing of people. So I think homegoing, you know, not saying in an arrogant sort of way, but is a data visualization where we've thought long and hard of how to convey data on the passing of people from a Black perspective, right? And so I welcome anyone to take a look at it and read. I wrote a little piece on medium.com that sort of breaks down how we were thinking about this visualization to transcend the datafication of Black death and to sort of recover and restore Black life. So if someone has the URL, you can put it in the chat and then hopefully people can take a look at it.
Yeah, that was inspiring. It was inspiring for us too, Kim. I made sure our whole team looked at that and shared your article in Medium.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So for our last question, this is from Jacob Zabrowski. I think I said that last name right. Is the right to allow or deny digital resurrection connected to the concept of the right to be forgotten in any way?
It's a good question. So the right to be forgotten as it's conceived right now comes out of the European GDPR right to be forgotten legislation that, I want to say it was maybe passed in the 90s. No. Anyway, I can't remember exactly when it was passed, but 2005. Anyway, so that legislation basically says that you have the right to have something taken down from the internet if it doesn't represent you in a way that you feel is appropriate. The most common requests are for things like violent crime, so it's really 2016. Was it that recent? I feel like it might be older than that. Anyway, it's for folks that work in tech, I know that it's one of the, it's like a bane of their existence, the GDPR, because it's the thing that says, do you consent to your data being used, right? Then they get takedown requests that they then have to honor if it's coming from someone out of the EU. And so I think building on those ideas, and the GDPR isn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but building on those ideas, I think the rights that we could enjoy in this country to be forgotten, to not have our data be collected, to refuse to be documented, if that is a choice that we make, right? There are models, I guess, that we can build from or use. In a lot of ways in the United States, the First Amendment gets in the way, right? Because the public's right to know interferes with the individual's right to be forgotten.
Interesting.
Okay, so I think we're out of questions, but I have a question. So Dr. Gallen, at the beginning, you said that you believe that years from now, like Black newspapers will be how we understand Blackness in this present time.
Yeah, one of the ways, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm just curious, coming from a library and archives perspective, what can we be doing now to make sure that folks have access to these Black newspapers? Shout out to West Side Gazette, which is our Black newspaper here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And other people shouted out in the chat their local Black newspapers, but just talk to us, because when I think about Black newspapers, I go back to the librarians and archivists of the past who created clipping files and all those things that were important to understanding Blackness, where they had to kind of curate a kind of comprehensive story about Blackness and topically or subject matter wise. And I'm just thinking about like what that means in terms of
Yeah.
the digital space and not printing newspapers like we once
Yeah.
did and all that.
Yeah.
So just some
So
thoughts.
I'm going to share this question with Paulette as a publisher. So, you know, I used to be a librarian, not an archivist, but obviously a Black press researcher and historian. And my quick question, I'll let Paulette do the second half of this, is make the archives and funding and support for existing archives. We don't even have what we access to the archives of Black newspapers 20, 30, 50, 100 years ago. Some of those archives are now in white institutions, which I think is problematic, quite frankly. Some of those archives are inaccessible. Some people have stacks of newspapers that haven't even been digitized. So we could start off with just getting some money to Black press organizations and publishers now to archive. And then I'll let Paulette answer it, because I know we have to go soon.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. We were able to partner with a university to have our paper digitized, because it's, like I said, 50 years publishing once a week for 50 years. I think though, when it comes to digital, and like as papers start to make that transformation and we don't print anymore, I still print, although not everything I put online is in our print. So that's, I think, partnering with folks like this organization, folks who are, you know, archivists now who are thinking, and I talk to Burgess about this all the time, you know, the Doc Now project, and people who are trying to understand how to protect and document what we're producing now. We're as, I think, as legacy papers, the ones who are still doing the work, we're still trying to understand the digital space, just how we do work in the digital space. We haven't even thought about how are we documenting what we do. And I know we lost, just as when we changed servers, because we had a corruption in our database, we lost articles. Like, and so we had one of our writers who had been writing for years said, why can't I find all my articles? Yeah. And so we need, I think, as an industry and as you know, a sector within the news industry, we need to have a partnership with folks like you guys who are thinking about that and helping us understand how to document what we're doing in the digital space, because I think that's a big problem. It is a gap that needs to be filled. Yeah.
So we have just like a minute left. If any of you have any final thoughts that you like to share, please jump in.
I just want to say thank you. This was an amazing conversation. It was really hands down one of the best things I've done in terms of a conference or symposium format. I love it. Thanks to Tonia and Paulette for saying, let's just have a conversation, because I had the PowerPoint ready to get loaded up. Let's just have a conversation. So thank you very much to Archiving the Black Web, Tonia, Paulette. This has been an amazing conversation.
Yeah, just to echo the same thing. And thank you for, you know, looking at the Black press too. I mean, and valuing the work that the Black press does. There's still hundreds of papers that are publishing. I'm a second generation publisher. I know quite a few third generation, fourth generation folks who we talk about bearing witness. Like you're committed to doing this work and finding ways to continue to do it, even with all the tremendous challenges we're facing. So thank you.
Yeah, I just want to also say thanks, extend a huge shout out to Archiving the Black Web, and big thanks to Kim and Paulette for being present and for just a beautiful conversation. I'm overfilled with joy and gratitude today.
Well, we thank you, and we thank the audience as well for their participation in the chat. And so we're going to get ready for our panel 4, which is There Are Black People. Let me get it right. There Are Black People in Future Web Archives, which is a play on There Are Black People in the Future. So we're going to turn it on to DJ Nooney with some more of his curated music around archiving the Black Web. So stay tuned. We'll be back in a few minutes. Thank you.
Ho!